America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be revisiting History of Political Philosophy, 3rd edition, edited by Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey. This book was originally published in 1960... Let me double check here. 1963. This 3rd edition I have is from 1987. There are some updates to some of the essays in the 3rd edition. It's comprised of a whole bunch of essays. Most of them are by a variety of authors, although I will say Leo Strauss and Joseph Cropsey each have a couple of essays. Each essay discusses a different political philosopher. This is my 4th episode that I have looked at this book, and I'm just focused on Enlightenment thinkers. Today I'm going to look at David Hume. Previously, I looked at Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Montesquieu. Today's David Hume, then one more next episode, and then we'll move on. So, David Hume. I'm a fan of David Hume. I think he is somewhat of a misunderstood philosopher. I don't know as though he has really been completely, or is commonly appreciated the way that he should be for what he was really trying to say. I'm not sure people really understood where David Hume was coming from. I think he has some important things to say about the limits of rationality. And so I'm gonna jump in here and read some of this. Like all my episodes, I'll be reading a couple of sections of this essay. Then I'll be providing some feedback. David Hume was a writer who wrote in the 18th century. He lived from 1711 to 1776. And he's generally understood as a skeptic, although I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, and that's, I think, where he's misunderstood. I think he proposes skepticism, but he also proposes, I think, some degree of solution to the skepticism. Anyway, I'm going to jump in here and start reading. I'll start with this section here, where he talks about the skepticism of David Hume. And so, in this section, he says, quote, Hume's principal concern is not with that kind of reasoning that through intuition or demonstration discovers the relations of ideas, but rather with probable reasoning, by which we discover matter of fact and real existence, and which guides us all our lives, and indeed composes most of our philosophy. Now, all our reasoning about matter of fact is based, he says, on the relation of cause and effect. Without causation, we cannot go beyond our senses and memory. By causation, we are enabled to infer the existence of objects and occurrences beyond our experience. So the discussion of probability resolves itself into an examination of causation. Hume begins by raising skeptical doubts concerning cause and effect. Consider a particular instance of the inference from cause to effect. For example, we see a billiard ball moving across a table and striking another. We conclude that the second one will begin to move. What is the basis for this conclusion? It is not made known to us by reason, for it is possible to conceive of the movement not following the collision. It must then be founded on experience. We have seen balls collide and set in motion in the past, but it still remains conceivable that they might not do so in this case. The inference is then based on experience, together with the assumption that the future will resemble the past. But what is the basis of this principle? Not reason, for it is conceivable that the future will not resemble the past. Experience, then. But how can we learn from experience the very principle that alone makes it possible to learn from experience? We seem to be at a dead end. But now Hume presents his skeptical solution of these skeptical doubts. When we have observed one event succeeding another in a number of instances, the mind gets in the habit of considering them together. So when I see one billiard ball striking another, my imagination, falling into a familiar groove, is led to think of the second ball's moving. And I not only form this conception, but I believe in it, which means simply that it feels different from ideas I do not believe in. What its feeling is hard to describe. The idea is conceived in a stronger or more vivid or firmer manner, so that it forms a part of what we call reality, along with impressions and the ideas of the memory. In sum, all reasonings about causation are nothing but the effects of custom, and custom has no influence but by enlivening the imagination and giving us a strong conception of any object. Another question is considered, the idea of cause and its origin. We observe, for instance, one billiard ball striking another, causing it, as we say, to move. From what impression is the idea of cause derived? What we observe is that the collision of the balls and the motion of the second are contiguous events, that one occurs prior in time to the second, and finally that on repetition this conjunction of events is found to be constant. That is all. Yet there is more to the idea of causation than contiguity, priority, and constant conjunction. We commonly suppose that there is a necessary connection between the two events. From what impression can this come? Hume answers, from nothing in the objects, but from something in the mind, namely, the feeling of being compelled or determined to pass in the imagination from cause to effect. We mistakenly transfer this impression to the objects themselves, but in fact, necessity lies not in the objects, but in ourselves. The argument that has been sketched above follows a pattern that recurs frequently in Hume's philosophy. What is accepted unquestioningly by common sense, here causation, elsewhere the existence of a world of objects not dependent on our perception of them, and elsewhere even the continued existence of a personal self, is found to have no rational basis, but it is dissolved only to be restored. Nature is too strong for reason, and an account is given of the way in which reason is overcome, but the overcoming is of a dubious nature. The skeptical doubts are not refuted, nor are they simply shaken off in the name of common sense, in the manner of Dr. Johnson refuting Berkeley by kicking a stone. They receive a solution, but a skeptical solution. What is restored is not quite what has been dissolved. Thus, the inference from cause to effect is a habit. The belief in what is inferred is an inexplicable feeling. The idea of cause is a mistake. End quote. Okay, so there's a bunch of stuff in there, but he's talking about cause and effect primarily. And let's see, at the very beginning of that section where he says that Hume's principal concern is not with that kind of reasoning that through intuition or demonstration discovers the relation of ideas, but rather with probable reasoning by which we discover matter of fact and real existence, and which guides us all our lives, and indeed composes most of our philosophy. So there's two different types of cognition here, two different types of reasoning. There's the ideas of the way, there's the reasoning of the way one idea interacts with another idea. And this is sort of like if you were to go back and listen to In Defense of Tradition by Richard Weaver, way back when, he talks about dialectic versus rhetoric. And this is sort of the dialectic. This is a set of ideas in your mind that relate to one another. If this idea, then that idea. And then, therefore, that idea. It's a rational sequence of concepts that can be inferred from one another. But they're all contained within the mind. And they don't actually meet with reality. Where our minds meet with reality is through perceptions. And there's a reasoning that occurs in how we interact with our perceptions, how we process and categorize and understand our perceptions, how we translate our perceptions into our understanding of the world. And that's a different sort of reasoning. And that's where Hume is concerned with. And he's talking about cause and effect as the principal rational faculties that allow us to process the things that we see and interact with in the world. So he uses the example here of the billiard ball. And I think this is an interesting point where he says, if you see a billiard ball, you hit a billiard ball on a pool table, and the cue ball hits the next ball, you expect that the other ball that it hits is going to move in some way. It's collided, the first ball is collided with it, and you expect that the second ball will move. and you expect that the first ball striking the second ball will cause the second ball to move. Now, you may understand physics, you may study physics, and you may say, well, because of this reason or that reason is why this happens, this is how the cause occurs, this is the mechanism by which the causation and the effect occur. But the truth is, you could be a 10-year-old and have no clue about physics whatsoever. And you could still see the ball hit the other ball and know that the other ball will move. And you would still say that the first ball hitting the second ball caused the second ball to move. It doesn't require knowledge of physics to have the concept of cause and effect, in your mind, processing the information. And he says that cause and effect is really just a habit of thought. And this really comes down to the future being like the past. Let's say the sun. Is the sun going to rise tomorrow? The sun has risen every day. Will the sun rise again tomorrow? We expect that the future will be like the past. And all of our laws of physics depend upon the expectation that the future will be like the past. And rationally, you can't really prove that the future will be like the past because you don't know what the future will hold. Maybe all of the laws of physics will change tomorrow. You can't there are a whole bunch of things that you can't really rationally pin down. When it comes down to it, how do you know this thing? How do you know that this is going to happen? How do you know that you are going to be the same person tomorrow that you are today? That there's a continuous connection of who you are from moment to moment. There are a whole bunch of things that we trust, and it's just natural for us to trust these things. And Hume says it's like a habit that we form to trust these things that really stand outside the bounds of reason and rationality. And these are the basic mechanisms by which we operate. But it's not reason and rationality as much as we would like to think it is, so much as it is habit and experience. So this kind of skepticism, he doesn't actually say so much that you really honestly don't know whether the sun will rise tomorrow. He doesn't say that you have no clue when the one billiard ball hits the other billiard ball. Maybe the other billiard ball will move, maybe it won't move. You don't know. You can't possibly know. That's the sort of deep skepticism that I think Hume is accused of. But all Hume is saying, I think, is that your reason and rationality isn't what leads you to believe that the second ball will move. It's your experience and your habits of mind, your habits of thought, and your experience and your concepts of how the world works that you've acquired just merely by repetition of observation. So he's not saying that the billiard ball might move and the billiard ball might not move and nobody knows. You know, you just don't know through reason. So anyway, he moves on to talk about morals and uses some of the same concepts when he examines morality. And in that regard, he says the following, quote, Hume concludes that virtue and vice are neither relations nor matters of fact. That is, they are not objects of the understanding, and hence the sense of morality does not consist in their discovery. Another and more prominent line of argument is summarized as follows. Morals excite passions and produce or prevent actions. Reason, of itself, is utterly impotent in this particular. The rules of morality, therefore, are not conclusions of our reason. By the impotence of reason, Hume means this. An action is the result of a propensity or an aversion to some object, and this propensity or aversion is excited, usually at least, by the pleasure or pain given by or expected from the object. Now, reason can inform us of the existence of objects and of the relations among them, but if the objects are indifferent to us, if they arouse no propensity or aversion, this information has no influence on the will. So reason alone cannot produce, or by the same token prevent, any action. As Hume puts it in a famous sentence, reason is, and ought only to be, the slave of the passions, and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. Yet it is clear that reason, in conjunction with passion, may have a strong, if oblique and mediate, influence on the will. It may prompt passion by informing it of the existence of its object. For example, I am of the opinion that behind a garden wall there is a tasty fruit, and my desire for it is founded on that opinion. And reason may direct passion to its object by tracing the connection of causes and effects. I may hit on the expedient of getting a ladder and climbing the wall. In such case, the part of reason may be great and even decisive. Thus, if I learn that my opinion about the existence of the fruit, or the best way to get it, is incorrect, my passion and volition cease. But reason's role remains a ministerial one, for it does not supply the impulse that moves us. The calm and indolent judgments of the understanding are then not sufficient to influence the will. And the crux of Hume's argument is that those judgments by which we distinguish good and evil are sufficient to influence the will. He denies that moral cognition is separable from a propensity or aversion to action. He denies, that is, that one can know what is morally good without feeling an inclination to it. End quote. So he's kind of saying that your morals depend on your passions, depend on your desire for pleasure and pain. You feel an aversion, like if you see something immoral happen, you feel an aversion. You feel like a sense of disgust. Oh, that's terrible, this thing I've witnessed. Or if you experience something morally gratifying, it's a sort of pleasant feeling. And so there's a passion or a sentiment that is outside of reason that is guiding your moral disposition. And he says basically that you can't really know a moral concept unless you feel it. Someone can explain to you, this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong. But it doesn't, you don't comprehend it as a moral fact unless you feel the rightness or the wrongness of it. It's just a concept if it's only been explained to you, and it doesn't have moral weight. So your morals are essentially driven like everything else. He says your reason is a slave to your passions. Basically, you want something, you want the fruit on the other side of the wall. Your reason tells you it's there. Your reason tells you that you can get a ladder to climb the wall to go get it. But your motivation to act, your motivation to do anything, is driven by some sort of desire for something or aversion from something, to get something, to avoid something, because you're after, ultimately, pleasure and pain. Those might be not just physical pleasures and pains, they might be moral pleasures and pains. You might act to do something because it feels right or it feels wrong, but that's still a form of pleasure and pain, and it's still a form of your sentiment and passion. So talking more about moral sentiment, he says, quote, "Since virtue and vice are not discovered by reason, it follows that we distinguish them by some sentiment or impression that they excite. The vice of a vicious action entirely escapes you as long as you consider the object. You can never find it till you turn your reflection into your own breast and find a sentiment of disapprobation, which arises in you towards this action. Here is a matter of fact, but 'tis the object of feeling, not of reason. It lies in yourself, not of the object. Morality, therefore, is more properly felt than judged of." More precisely, Hume argues not merely that virtue and vice are discovered by sentiment, but that they are constituted by sentiment. It is not that virtue is approved because it is virtue, but that virtue is virtue because it is approved. When an action is said to be virtuous, nothing is meant but that it gives rise to a feeling of approbation. Just as when an object is said to be the cause or effect of another, nothing is meant but that they are habitually united in the imagination. The sight of virtue, Hume observes, is pleasing, and that of vice displeasing. He further declares that the very sentiment of moral approbation is pleasing, and that of disapprobation displeasing. Indeed, he identifies the approbation and the pleasure. He denies that the approbation is an inference from the pleasure. He silently passes over the possibility that the pleasure is a consequence of the approbation. Rather, he reduces the approbation to the pleasure. To have the sense of virtue is nothing but to feel a satisfaction of a particular kind. We see then that the moral sense is not a distinct and peculiar faculty, and that moral sentiments are pleasures and pains. Moral sentiments are, however, pleasures and pains of a particular kind, differing in their feeling from other pleasures and pains, in the same way as, for instance, the pleasure given by a beefsteak differs from the pleasure given by a poem. These peculiar pleasures and pains arise only from the consideration of the characters and actions of rational beings, and arise when they are considered in general without reference to our particular interest. Thus we may esteem an enemy for these very qualities that make him dangerous to us. In sum, virtue is distinguished by the pleasure, and vice by the pain that any action, sentiment, or character gives us by the mere view or contemplation. Those qualities or characters that are esteemed as virtuous are found by Hume to be of four kinds. First, qualities that are useful to others, for example, justice, generosity, beneficence, honesty. Second, qualities that are useful to the one possessing them, for example, prudence, frugality, industry, temperance. Third, qualities that are immediately agreeable to others, for example, modesty, wit, decency. Finally, qualities that are immediately agreeable to the one possessing them, for example, a proper self-esteem, love of glory, magnanimity. It might be added that a quality may fall into more than one of these classes. For example, courage is not only useful to its possessor and to the public, but also gives an immediate pleasure to its possessor. In short, the objects of moral approbation are those qualities that are either immediately pleasant or productive of pleasure, either to their possessor or to others. The good is fundamentally identical with the pleasant, but it is not identical with one's own pleasure. In making moral judgments, we do not value others for their value to ourselves. Approbation is not bestowed on qualities because they give pleasure to us, but on the contrary, because they give pleasure to others, including the one who has them. Yet, in another sense, we should note it can be said that we approve of what pleases us because our very approbation consists in being pleased. Why do we approve of those virtuous qualities? Hume sometimes replies that we are moved by humanity or benevolence, but this is not to be understood as an original instinct or desire for the good of others. It is the manifestation of a more general and extremely important principle of human nature, sympathy, or that propensity we have to receive by communication from others their passions, sentiments, etc. It must be noted that sympathy is not the same as pity, and has no connotation of affection or goodwill. It is a mere conduit, through which pains, pleasures, passions, and so on are transmitted from one person to another. The object of moral approbation, then, is a source of pleasure. The sentiment of approbation is itself a pleasure, and the pleasantness of the sentiment is borrowed from that of the object. Thus, Hume is enabled to reject what he calls the selfish morality, and yet to avoid affirming the existence of general benevolence toward men apart from their relation to ourselves. He does this by postulating the operation of sympathy, which makes the pleasures and pains of others our own, but does so, as it were, mechanically, without the interposition of either goodwill to our fellows or calculations of self-interest. End quote. Okay, so that's a somewhat challenging section, especially toward the end there. He breaks down virtues into these different kinds, and I'm not sure that it's really super useful. I think that if you look back to the episode on the origins of virtue and altruism and things of that nature, looked at from an evolutionary perspective, we find that a lot of these things that we call virtues, we feel that something is good because it is good for the society or the group or the tribe in which we live, the community. Something is beneficial to the community, it's beneficial to another person who is in the community, it's beneficial especially to someone who is close to us, and we evolve to have these tendencies toward considering things that are beneficial either to me or to the people around me, the people whom I depend on and the people who depend on me in order for society to function. The thing that's good for them is also therefore in that way good for me, although I may not think about it that way. The fact remains that a person in a healthy, strong society has a greater evolutionary chance of survival, and the group, the tribe, if you will, itself has a better chance of survival when its members find pleasant those actions that strengthen the tribe and that make the other people stronger and strengthen the bonds that exist between them. A society with weak bonds between people, people who distrust each other, people who cheat on each other, people who betray each other, such a society has weak bonds, and the people in such a society suffer. So this is, like I said, this is written long before evolutionary theory. So some of his explanation as to how sympathy operates, and I think there's something to that, but it's all in a way sort of a primitive notion because he doesn't take into effect genetics, evolution, or the hardwiring of altruism and virtuous concepts into our brains by our biological, neurological structure. So from that point, I want to jump to where he talks a bit about society. He takes some of these notions of morals and begins to apply them to societies and the best way for a society to operate. And in this section, he says, quote, "The bonds of allegiance ought not to be dissolved but held tight. Human society is a continuing body, gaining and losing members every moment, and hence stability in government is essential. It is necessary for the sake of peace and order that there be government and rulers. It is desirable, of course, that the form of government be good, and that the rulers be suitable. But to make the superiority of a form of government, or the suitability of a particular ruler, the overriding standard, is to open the door to that very strife and disorder that government is meant to exclude. Hence, the claims of the established order should be given the greatest weight. Every government, Hume says, is founded on opinion. The main support of the rule of the few over the many, in other words, of the weak over the strong, is the opinion that those in authority have a right to that authority. This opinion is usually the fruit of time and habit. Custom is the great guide of human life. Most men never think of inquiring into the reasons for the authority of the form of government to which they have become habituated. Or, if they should, they are satisfied to be told that it has prevailed for a long time and that they are treading in the path of their forebears. Antiquity always begets the opinion of right. That foundation of government, truly in accordance with men's natural inclinations, is not contract, but custom. From the above consideration, it appears that there are limits to what can be done in the way of innovation, and more important, since novelty too has its charms, to what ought to be done. Violent innovation is never justified. To shake the authority of custom and antiquity gives it not to reason, which is an uncertain guide with little sway over man, but to every man's private interest, disguised as reason. The wise statesman, therefore, will bear a reverence to what carries the marks of age. In attempting to improve a constitution, he will adapt his innovations to the ancient fabric, so as not to disturb society. His caution may be reinforced by reflection on the limits of human foresight. Political measures have many consequences that cannot be foretold. One must be guided by experience. One must learn of errors by feeling their inconvenience when it appears. Time not only strengthens political institutions, it also perfects them. Hume begins, we see, from the most fundamental principles of the modern natural law teaching, and draws consequences that are, to a large extent, like those of Locke. At the same time, and working from the same principles, he rejects important elements of Locke's teaching and becomes a strong advocate of conservatism. His political doctrine thus presents something of a paradoxical appearance, and perhaps contains a certain tension, reflected in his maxim that there is nothing of greater importance in every state than the preservation of the ancient government, especially if it be a free one. End quote. Okay, so you can see there that Hume is a bit of a political conservative. And I think that this is an important point to understand Hume in general, because he says that, the bonds of allegiance are important, and the stability that government provides is important. And so if you take the society, he says, to make the superiority of a form of government or the suitability of a particular ruler the overriding standard is to open the door to the very strife and disorder government is meant to exclude. If you say, well, we need to dissolve the government because it has this form and it really should have that form, or we need to shake things up, we need to alter this, we need to alter that, and you start changing things, or, this particular person is no good and so they need to be overthrown because that is a bad king. So whether it's the person or it's the structure, if that's the most important thing, then you start bringing in disorder. And government exists to prevent disorder. And so it's like becomes a question of, why did you bother having a government at all if you're just going to switch it around and change it all the time, opening the door to constant chaos. He says government is founded on opinion. And he says the opinion is usually the fruit of time and habit. Custom is the great guide of human life. Most men never think of inquiring the reasons for the authority of the government, or if they do, they're satisfied to be told that it's prevailed for a long time, and they're treading in the path of their forebears. So, custom, so think about the billiard ball, right? When we assume that the second billiard ball will move by sheer custom, habit, experience. We've seen it a bunch of times. It's happened that way a bunch of times. We live by customs and habits. We don't live by reason and rationality. We don't solve all of our problems. We don't engage in the various activities that we engage in on a moment-to-moment basis by constantly reevaluating everything we do in every place and every time through the process of reason. We fall into habits, and we make minor adjustments to our habits in order to keep us functioning. We don't want to have to use our brain to solve every single problem. We want to be able to have habits that solve some of our problems for us so that we can put our mental efforts toward other things. William James talked about this in his psychology book. And so there's a connection here where he doesn't say, well, you need to devote your governmental structure to endless rationalistic analysis. He says the opposite of that. And when we deal with life on a day-to-day basis, we're not subjecting everything to constant rational skepticism. So to the extent that Hume is seen as a skeptic because he says certain rational truisms don't really add up as much as we would like them to, and that things rely much more on the sentiment of rationality, like William James talked about, in the same way our governments and our societies depend upon the sentiment of rationality, they depend upon custom and habit, and they prove themselves over the course of time. And our government is not the sort of thing that must constantly justify itself or prove itself to a rational inquiry. The mere fact that it exists and has existed successfully over some period of time is its own justification. And in that way, David Hume is a conservative. So I'm going to wrap it up right there. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll talk to you again next time.